When we think about the next 25 years, we have to think about the last 25 years. And I think if you think about the industry that we've been in, Jobs was the guy, okay, around 2000 that actually led what is probably the largest, most sustained technology growth in history. And if you think about the last 25 years, all of us have sat here. We haven't had to deal with a lot of little recessions or little bumps in the road. And it really started with Steve and then went on. And I think one of the things that's also interesting is it was great leadership that got us there. And I think as we start to think about the next 25 years, it's also going to be about leaders. So some of the key themes we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to talk about artificial intelligence. As many of you know, it's probably the biggest topic around the world. Anytime you go to a conference right now, AI is front and center. The other thing we're going to talk about is also the health of the digital economy. And I'll give you some thoughts on, obviously, we feel like we're in a great space, but there are some troubling moments and issues around the world that actually may impact us as we go forward. And we're also going to talk about one of the biggest issues also going forward is the role of electricity and power and utilities as we start to think about our digital infrastructure. For the first time, we're actually looking at a situation where industries that were never impacted by digital infrastructure are being fundamentally changed. And then finally, one of the big topics that we've talked about for many, many years in this forum has been satellites. And satellites have quietly kind of been in the background for a long time. And this year, for the first time, we're starting to see them coming back into the forefront. So we'll spend a little bit of time on satellite. And then last, the role of government. And as you look around this room today, there's actually 167 government officials that are actually registered for this conference, okay? And this is up from about 25 to 30 last year. So we actually, for the first time, are starting to see regulators, government officials getting back involved in the industry in a very, very proactive way. And I think this is actually great for our industry, and I think it's going to be a key thing for us as we go forward. So I'll spend a little bit of time on that and then talk about what our goals are for the PTC over the next day. I'll tell you, I've studied AI. One of the things I have to do before these speeches, I have to go through and look at everything that's going on. And I'll tell you, AI will change the world as we know it. It's already changing it now. We talked about this last year at the conference. It was sort of a little idea that was impacting us. Now it's in everybody's life. There isn't anybody in this room that actually isn't using AI in some function or something that they're doing today. If you look at, and when you start to look at the numbers, and these are forecasts from McKinsey, you start to look at it and you say, okay, this chart over here shows you what's going on with the cloud business. And cloud has actually been the driver of most of the data centers, and largely the digital infrastructure around the world has been driven by cloud. And that's been the main growth driver for the last few years. AI is predicted over the next 5 years to actually eclipse that. So you'll actually have this second growth sector. And if you look at just the amount of power that it's going to consume and the size of the buildings that it's going to use and the number of servers it's going to use, you're essentially going to have a business that's almost $1.3 trillion of new revenue that will be generated by 2032. And just to give you perspective, if you look at the 3 top tech companies today, they actually generate $1.3 billion in revenue. So it's saying that we're actually going to have, in 7 years from today, almost $1.3 billion. So almost 3 new companies at the top of the stack that didn't exist as of 2 years ago. And what's causing that? Largely it's servers. And so what we're seeing is, for the first time, server technology is driving massive growth. And it's also, it's hitting us in terms of the power. But if you look at what generative AI, if you start looking at these server farms that are being built, it's a fundamental change. So we've gone from, if you looked around this room and we were talking to data center operators last year or 2 years ago, they'd be talking in a large transaction would be 30 to 50 megawatts. Now we're talking about gigawatt campuses. And it is a fundamental change. It's almost 10 to 20 times where it was just 2 years ago. And so I think, and whether these numbers are real or whether they're actually somewhat off, nobody really knows. But the reality is, it is a big change. If you look at it, this is what we call the balance sheet of the future. And this actually shows where the revenue is going to come from. And it's really looking at 2022, from 2023 to 2027 and up to 2032. And if you look at it, essentially computers are going to be a big portion of the revenue, but it's also going to be the data center industry. It's actually going to be all of the key areas. It's going to be network, submarine cables, fiber. All these things are going to be key components. This is actually going to cause an enormous change in the data center business. as we know it. We predict, and this is actually from 3 different groups, that roughly you'll have a 33% growth in data centers over the next 5 years. That's just as a result of artificial intelligence. Now, this is a chart that Jonathan Aiken actually presents, and you'll see Jonathan, he's going to actually, one of the moderators will be up here. Jonathan does a chart every year where he looks at the capital invested by the large hyperscalers. And if you look at the hyperscalers, this number is actually what feeds many of us in this room every year. This is the money that comes out of the Google, the Facebook, the Microsoft that's paid for CapEx. And that CapEx translates into revenue for most of us. These numbers, actually, the great thing about it is there was a bit of a slowdown last year. So when I presented this chart a year ago, there was a slight downturn in terms of cloud revenue. But cloud revenue has come back this year, and it's almost growing at the speed it was 3 years ago. So the good news is we're still seeing fairly good growth across the industry. That said, there are some troubling factors if we start thinking about this industry. And I'll just point your nose to the bottom of this line. And Warren Buffett uses an index, which he calls, when he looks at the capitalization of the United States market, and he compares it to GDP, okay? Right now, the United States market is essentially trading at 200% of GDP. The last time it ever got in a zone like this, you can probably guess. It was around the internet boom of 2000. And so reality is, even though the market looks very, very strong, there are some things that are a little troubling out there. And, and it doesn't mean that we're going into a recession, but it's something we need to think about, that we're actually at a point where it's a very, very hyped market that we're in right now. If you look at the 5 companies at the top of the tech sector, they control right now 65% of the market capitalization. This is unprecedented, okay, if you look at it over the history of time. And it continues to do this. It's every year it's been like this for the last 10 years. So reality is, this may be the reality of how it goes forward, but nobody knows. And it's, if you look at the present, the last 100 years, it's very unusual to have a situation like this. But one of the things that's interesting is the names of the companies has changed. If you look back at 2000 to 2005 to 2010, those top 5 companies were constantly changing. These top 5 haven't changed at all in the last 10 years. One of the things that's also interesting is, as we think about CapEx, one of the things that's actually happening in our industry for the first time is that some of our largest customers are actually building their own infrastructure. And so there was at a time when submarine cables and data centers, towers were all built by telcos, they were built by operators. And now what we're seeing for the first time is the companies that are actually the customers are actually building their own stuff. And especially at the top end. If you start looking at large server farms today, a lot of these are being built by the customer themselves, which is going to have an impact, okay, as we start to think about our businesses as we go forward. Doesn't mean it's the end of the world, but it actually just means there's a different type of infrastructure that's coming. This is a chart that I actually love to bring up because this is a chart that was brought up in 2002 and 2003, and it was what the private equity and distressed guys looked at in those years. And they started to look at, one of the things that you have when you have a hyped market is essentially everyone is focused on something called EBITDA. But the reality is health in our businesses is really about EBITDA minus CapEx. And if you don't look at those 2 numbers side by side, sometimes you'll actually miss what's really going on. And if you start to look at our industry right now, the amount of capital that's actually being spent versus EBITDA, it's actually declining. So you've actually got a situation where that EBITDA minus CapEx line, if you went across a large portion of our industry right now, you're going to see a decline in those numbers. And part of that is for a couple reasons. One is revenue generating CapEx, and this is actually, it's not just the telcos or the data centers that are having this issue. This is actually happening in Google and Facebook and some of the big over the top players. The hyperscalers are actually seeing this. And this is very similar to what happened right before the tech meltdown. Doesn't mean it's coming, but it's just it's a bit of a warning sign that actually there might be some issues. Another thing that's interesting is if you look at digital infrastructure, and I think one of the things that we're going to talk about in one of our, I think it's the 3rd panel, is going to be talking about fiber. And one of the things that many of you, and we look around this room, roughly 20% of the people that are here at PTC are in the telecom industry, okay? This used to be 95% telecom people, and it was 5% tech. Now it's roughly 20% of the people, almost 50% of the people that come to this conference are related to data centers, which is sort of an interesting change. And one of the things that's interesting, though, is you look at the bottom, you can probably see why. The telcos, if you look at the bottom, what's been their performance? Essentially, in the digital infrastructure, there really hasn't been a great return on investment. So anyone that's been buying telcos, they've essentially been flat for the last 10 years. Meanwhile, the technology guys, the OTTs and the hyperscalers have been off the charts. They've been growing at 30 to 40%. And this has really been the change. Because if you looked at 2000, 2001, the people who were actually up here on the stage talking all the time, the big companies that everybody loved, it was NTT, it was AT&T, they were the big telcos. It was Nortel, and now the reality is it's hyperscalers. And they've actually taken to a point where actually they dominate everything that we're doing. They're actually building more data centers than our data center industry is building. They're building more submarine cables than our traditional telcos have built. And there's a real shift that's actually happening here where these 5 dominant players are now actually getting integrated into our system, and they're actually the guys that are driving this. Okay, one of the big things, and this is an exciting thing, I just came from a breakfast where we actually were talking about power and electricity. And I think one of the things that's interesting is, as an industry, we chased always eyeballs. We were always about the internet, and we were like, how do we get closer to the customer? Well, the reality is, right now, the biggest challenge is how do we get close to electricity? Because electricity is now becoming the long pole in the tent. If you start thinking about AI, when you have this shift that's so large in terms of the amount of power that you need, it's actually becoming so important to actually, how do we get infrastructure to where you have electricity? And this is an interesting chart. This shows the reality of today, what's going on in terms of the amount of power required. You look at this line right here, and it's actually shifted up. Now you think about regulated industries like power, and one of the things we were talking about is it takes anywhere from 4 to 5 years to get a power plant approved in the United States. And then it takes another 5 years after that to actually build the plant. So it's a 10-year planning cycle to basically bring on power. And you've just had a shift right now where we have the demand going up by almost 3x what was predicted just a year ago. So you start thinking about the planning cycles, there's a real disconnect, all right? You have these 10-year planning cycles and you've got this massive uptick in power. You're gonna start to see a real challenge here in the United States. And this isn't just the United States. This is Japan, this is Taiwan, this is Hong Kong, and it's even China, to be honest. And so the reality is, this is a problem that needs to be fixed. And this is also one of the challenges is not only are we going to need more power, but we're also going to become one of the most polluting industries very quickly. Because if you look at today, the power that's actually generated from our data centers, most of them are actually carbon. Carbon's used in most of the markets that we're actually in. And so the reality is, yes, there are green data centers and there's a real push in that direction, but the reality is today we are a polluting industry and we're going to be a very big polluting industry in the years ahead. The other challenge you've got is if you look at where the data centers are and also where the data centers need to be. Okay, right now most data centers are in Western Europe, they're in the United States, and they're in Asia. But if you think about it, you've got places like India, Africa, Latin America. These are sort of virgin territories. And there's also, so if you put now also the power plants around the world and where the power is located, it's an entirely different map. And you start to look at it and say, oh my God, some of the places that we can actually get the power to do AI are not where the data centers are today. They're actually in different places. And so you're gonna have this, and you start thinking about the average AI data center today takes anywhere from 4 terabytes to 25 terabytes of capacity, okay? So that just on the fiber side, you need 20 terabytes to actually have one of these centers in place. And if you're going to a country that maybe only has a single terabyte of capacity, coming into the country, this opens up a whole new challenge. And it's a huge opportunity, I think, for us, but it's also a challenging situation for the data centers. And it also pushes your data center operator into understanding, they have to now understand fiber optic cables, they have to understand power, and it really reforms the entire industry. This is one of the things that also, you look at the United States, this is actually showing you where the power is located in the United States. And the challenge you've got is, if you look at the traditional markets, think about, everyone here knows about Ashburn, Virginia. Everybody's there, that's one of the big internet locations. You also have California. If you look at Northern California is also one of the key internet locations. That's not where the power is, and that's not where the power is coming. And so you start to see that where the demand is and where the actual power is actually being built are totally different places. So you have just in the United States alone, you have a huge problem in terms of how you're going to build data centers, how are we going to bring AI on track when you got locations in the south when you actually need stuff in the north. And this is another thing, is if you look at countries, and you look at the top of this list, and I'm not going to try and offend anybody here, but if the places that actually have the lowest cost power in the world, okay, look at them. Are these places that we necessarily want to put massive infrastructure into today? Some of these places are at war. Some of them had very volatile governments. And there's been a lot of challenges. And this is just to show you where, if you wanted to go seeking low-cost power, these are the locations you'd have to go to, which actually creates an interesting strategy. So if you're thinking, oh, I need to build these models, this is a very, very interesting list. This is just an example, and one of the things that I think we're going to find over time is that places like Indonesia, Philippines, Iceland, these places actually generate new sources of power, so like thermal. If you start to think about new technologies, and these are places that not all of us have ever talked about. When we start thinking about data centers, we never talk about Iceland, we never talk about the Philippines, but these are places that actually have excess power, excess cheap power. And it's going to change the way we look at actually, if we look at the landscape of the world, we're going to be focused on a lot of new countries over the next decade. Okay, enough about data centers. We had an inauguration this morning, and again, a guy named Elon Musk is going to be very active in the new administration, and he's done a lot. If you look at what Starlink has done, you know, you've got geosatellites, and it's interesting, if you were at the PETA meetings that took place yesterday or in here, one of the challenges of all the Pacific Islands is you now have geosatellites that actually can offer services to the end users that compete with the traditional telco. And this is the first time in history that we've ever had this. And so you actually have, for the first time, satellites coming back into the frame and saying, okay, this is actually a reasonable alternative to fixed line or wireless technology. And I think one of the things that we'll talk about here is the debate on what does that mean? You know, what does that mean for regulators? What does that mean for countries? What does that mean to how we actually operate going forward if these satellite companies, and by the way, Elon's not the only one. There's apparently 4 or 5 different satellite platforms that are coming into play, including the Chinese. They've launched something called 1,000 Sails, very similar constellation to what you've seen with Elon Musk's. And I think you're going to see a situation where there is going to be low-cost satellite opportunities across many of these emerging markets. And one of the big things that we always talk about here is the digital divide. Today, around the world, there's roughly 1.5 billion users that still don't use the internet. It's never been cost-effective to get to them. It's been very difficult to build networks. The reality is, we now have a solution for the first time. And I think it's going to be very interesting because the reality is we're probably going to have to use satellite. And many of us that have been, mobile operators or fixed line operators, this is an alternative for rural areas or underdeveloped areas. And I think it's going to be a challenge to figure out how do we actually work together with the satellite operators to build a product that works together, that actually preserves our telecommunications infrastructure, but at the same time takes advantage of the cost that's now available to us. One of the other things is cables. Cables are getting much bigger and more concentrated. One of the things is traditionally, if you were in this room 20 years ago, fibers, you'd essentially have 2 to 4 fibers running in any given cable. And those fibers would carry somewhere in the range of 2 to 4 terabytes if you were lucky. Now, the cable that was actually launched in the Pacific is going to have between 16 and 20 fibers, and each fiber is going to carry 20 terabytes of capacity. And so you're starting to see that these cables, almost every 3 to 4 years, are generating more capacity that was traditionally already in the water. And this shows you one of the interesting things is our biggest years of building cables were 1998 to 2000. The reality is today, if you did it in $2,000 to today, we probably have the largest cable infrastructure building that's actually gone on in our history. Okay, if you start to look at it, apples to oranges or oranges to apples, apples to apples. But the reality is, we are seeing for the first time a real uplift in the amount of cables that are being built. And this is actually falling on the back of the digital infrastructure. The data centers are getting bigger, and as a result, we need more fiber going into those, and so you're getting a huge change. And part of that, as I mentioned before, a lot of it's just been technology changes in the last 5 years. And it was interesting, when I ran a submarine cable company, and we would see roughly 10 to 15% reduction in price every year. Right now you're seeing 30 to 40% reduction in price. And part of that is the average throughput on a cable is actually increasing by 3 to 4 times every 5 years. The good news is we actually have, in the offices of these large over-the-top hyperscalers, a belief about the future. And I think one of the things is they all are believing that this is going to be big. And the good news is I think they will be investing ahead of growth. Because I think one of the challenges, as you start thinking about it, these are big investments, and there are challenges right now in the world of people saying, oh, should we be spending money on cables or not on cables? And I think most of the key executives in the top hyperscalers realize the importance of submarine cables and fiber. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is they're looking at it and saying, okay, we got to start looking out 10 years and make sure that we're ready. All right, this is one more group that I want to just, key point that I want to get on is, and this is one thing that I would actually encourage you to do, is take your AI program and look at the 2025 leadership model and look at what Elon Musk is saying. Because I think one of the interesting things is these two guys are facing off, these two groups within the United States are taking diametrically opposed views. And it would have actually come, Trump had to actually navigate this morning in his inauguration. But the challenge going forward is, do the Americans go forwards with AI like they have traditionally done with cloud and many of these other services, where the view is, let's lead the world, let's go out, let's make it a global product that has a global supply chain, and let's go out and do that? Or do we go towards a protectionist model, where essentially you say, okay, AI is going to stay in the United States, and we're basically going to ring fence the United States, so we're going to keep all the technology there. And this is the challenge that's coming ahead, I think, with the governments in terms of how we actually think about AI going forward. This is a chart that was actually sent out a few weeks ago, and it basically said these countries will get AI technology, and those countries in the red will not. So you can see that, and if you start thinking about data centers, if this is the type of thing that's coming out there, this creates chaos for infrastructure. Because you have 10-year planning cycles, and all of a sudden they're saying, oh, these countries actually, we can't build large data centers in these locations. And this is actually the reason why all of us, our challenge in the next couple of years is to make sure we engage with governments and think about collaboration. Because if this actually happens, this causes a lot of difficulties for all of us in this room. When I was in DC recently, we had a DC meeting. We talked about two of the biggest challenges. Obviously, the United States, and we have many Chinese partners here. And I'll tell you, one of the things that we at the PTC have always been very, very embracing to saying we're not an American conference, we're a global conference. And one of the key challenges right now, though, taking the elephant in the room here, China and the United States are in a trade battle, okay? And this is actually because anyone that's in the cable business, who's in the equipment business, knows this, okay? And this has actually created a fairly large challenge for us, and it's actually causing some issues in the Pacific. And I think one of the things that we really need to do is think about, is this the right way to go forward? Or should we actually be trying to continue to have engagement? Because one of the things that our industry has always worked when it's global and we're engaged and people are talking to each other. We're one of the few industries that you can't operate with one country not involved. You actually have to operate as a system. We all have to be on the same page. There are many different viewpoints. You can read through them. There's thousands of books that tell you how we should actually operate in the Pacific. I think the most important thing is that everyone works together. And I think engagement, and that's one of the great things about our industry. You have no choice but to engage. You want to go through the South China Sea, you got to talk to the Chinese. If you want to get something into California, you got to talk to the Americans. The reality is these cables, this infrastructure doesn't work unless we're all talking to each other. That's one. I'll give you my final thoughts, and I'll reiterate that point. Essentially, we share the planet for global digital infrastructure. We've got to be open, and we've got to be collaborative. And I think one of the great things about PTC, and one of the things that we want to keep emphasizing, is the point about dialogue, and constant dialogue about these issues. Reality is also, AI is going to be big. It's going to change things, but it's also going to create an intrusion of government into our infrastructure. And so the reality is we really need to be all engaged in how we go forward. One of the other things is Governments will be mad. There are violations of the WTO that happened, and there are issues with currencies being manipulated that caused a lot of trade rifts. The reality is, I think we've got to start looking past these things. AI is bigger than that. We actually have to find ways to actually collaborate and not get caught into this world where we actually have haves and have-nots. AI has to be a collaborative model across the globe. And finally, I think the strategy that has actually worked, what's actually been great for our industry, is the idea that we continue to grow, we accelerate as a technology group, and we actually build things, and we build great things, and we accelerate all the time. We don't build barriers to future expansion. And I think that's one of the things that, as we come together here in this group, we need to actually talk to each other and say, all right, how do we actually grow together? And how do we do it in a way that all governments, all countries can do this? And to quote our last, unfortunately, one of our great leaders passed away a few weeks ago. But I think one of the things that he told us about, which is, I think, very, very important, is to have a series of principles that we operate under and continue to keep those principles at all times. And yes, sure, the world changes. There's going to be good guys and bad guys, and there's going to be wars and things like that. But the reality is, we've all operated together for a long time, and we need to continue to do that. And this is one of the things that, one of the messages I hope you get from the PTC is this event is about collaboration, it's about getting together, it's about airing differences, but it's also about trying to make ourselves as an industry have a voice and lead. And so one of the things I want to see us going forward is how do we actually drive this and be successful. Thank you very much.